Welcome. Welcome. Glad to be back myself, back in the saddle for this topic. For the last couple of years, I've spoken around this time of the year, Labor Day, on some issues having to do with unions, about people who work long hours for lousy wages. And I speak about their effort to organize, and I do so because in America today, economic inequality has created virtually a caste system. The slashing of public services and the monster of privatization is threatening to make this situation a permanent one. And it's disgraceful, and I think we need some radical change. There, I said it. I've been impressed with how workers have organized to talk about radical change in American history, and sometimes I admit unions can be their own worst enemies. They're scarred with corruption that scars every human social organization at one point or another. But the argument I've always made is that regardless of whatever negatives the press throws at the unions, no other type of organization has done more to improve the condition of the average person in history than unions. And I will defend that ad infinitum. So, I'm going to focus this year on working women, and I'm doing so for a couple of reasons, including the fact that if wage workers are at the bottom of our social hierarchy, then women workers have it worse. Dorothy Sue Cobble put it this way in her book called The Sex of Class, Women Transforming American Labor, quote, "Women started at the bottom and they remain there today." But another reason that I want to speak about working women is that I believe that empowering women in the workforce may be the last best hope we have for creating a society based on people, not profits. Strong women and strong unions, inclusive and free of gender discrimination, could be the crucial part of a broad-based social justice movement reminiscent of the civil rights movement a generation ago. I have a friend, Susan Rose, who's an ethical culture leader up in Boston. She wrote about the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike of 1912. It was known as the Bread and Roses strike. More than half the strikers of that event were women and children, earning less than $6 a week. Susan pointed out, however, that the women just didn't want a few more bucks. As one author explained, Bread and Roses unionism is about higher wages, economic security, and decent health care, for all those who were here this morning. Those are what they were called standard of living issues. But it is also about, quote, making creativity, community, and learning possible at work, and about building stronger and more satisfying family and community relationships, end quote. Well, this fuller and more organic vision of a better world is shared by many of us in ethical humanism. We hope to contribute to a broad social evolution. In a labor song entitled Bread and Roses, the women's participation is crucial not just for workers, but for the entire human race. Susan Rose's favorite line from that song reflects on how the struggle of working women can bring out the best in humanity. The lyrics proclaim, "The rising of the woman means the rising of the race." The lyrics of Bread and Roses came from a poem by James Oppenheim, who worked at the Hudson Guild, which is an organization started by ethical culture leader John Lovejoy Elliott in 1895, and the Guild is still offering multiple services to the people of the Chelsea neighborhood in New York. This is just one of the many links between ethical culture and the labor movement that will come up today, but I want to support and bring back our heritage of being involved in the rights of working men and women in this country. Now, before I go into a little bit more history, I want to talk a little bit about voice and stereotypes. Voice and stereotypes. First, obviously, I can't speak for any woman. I can't speak for women in general. I can't speak for working women. But I did go to a number of women who have worked in the area of labor for information about this, including Ms. Evelyn Alloy. She's the creator of this book, Working Women's Music, the songs and struggle of women in the cotton mills, textile plants, and needle trades. And she's here today in the front row. Ms. Alloy, you're going to hear more about her and from her in a little bit. But she grew up where worker organizing was taken for granted. Her father organized barbers, and her mother was a unionized textile worker. All her life, all 96 plus years of her life, she has been involved in activism and in feminist causes, more than I can mention today, but including the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And you can meet her after the platform today and buy a copy of this book. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that and call her up near the end of my talk. But I also wanted to thank Betsy Lightborn, who lent me her copy of Alice Kessler Harris's book called Out to Work, A History of Wage-Earning Women in the United States. And I also want to thank Karen Nussbaum, a leading labor activist and feminist whose two sons I taught a couple of decades ago. So much of what I share today is just borrowed from these and other sources. Even the term working women, which is a term that Karen Nussbaum talked about, because she said that it emphasizes the pride a lot of working women have. It's not meant to say that women who stay in the home to raise a family aren't working. They are. But for many cultural reasons, that work is undervalued, underpaid, and underappreciated. But more and more women, according to Karen, call themselves working women when they go outside the home, and many of them are union members. Now, many of these women have to battle stereotypes, not just of the stay-at-home mom, but also of the more traditional but actually inaccurate image of a union worker being a burly man with a hard hat. And they have to also confront the claim that they're attacking men. They have to say what Mary Wollstonecraft said many years ago in her Vindication for the Rights of Women. She said, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." And I think that's what everybody here wants. They also have to overcome the ignorance about the integral role that women played in the labor movement. You can begin back in 1381, mentioned in Evelyn's book. Women in London protested because they were being forced to spin yarn. They sang a song in London at that time that is a song that they've sung in other words for centuries. Very simple lyric. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? 1381. Was this the first modern strike attacking gender stereotypes in the Western world? Maybe, but probably not. Constructed gender roles have been used to both oppress and protect women. In the 19th century, America grew a peculiarity in American history called the cult of domesticity, in which women were idolized as being morally pure, virtuous nurturers of future democratic citizens. Many assumed that for children to grow up to be civically minded Democrats, their primary nurturers, which were women, had to be kept out of dirty politics and business, right? So women were portrayed as fragile and in need of paternalistic protection, and this gilded cage grew around many women. Now, interestingly, this was a part of some legislation that many progressives found very positive back in 1908 when the Supreme Court ruled in Mueller versus Oregon. Now, Justice Louis Brandeis wrote the opinion that was later known as the Brandeis Brief, and he was helped on it by a woman named Josephine Goldmark of the National Consumers League. This woman happened to be sister-in-law of the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler. The double-sided nature of that legislation was that the ruling saved women from inhumane hours, but it reinforced the stereotype of the fairer sex. So this was a mixed blessing. Some feminist perspectives thought Mueller versus Oregon was a strike against strong, empowered, and independent women who struggled throughout history for their dignity and freedom. It was also a mixed blessing because it excluded blacks, agricultural workers, and white-collar clerics. But I want to go back to some history. I think history is important. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of my people I'll talk about in a minute, appreciated history because she said, history has a long-range perspective. It ultimately passes stern judgments on tyrants and vindicates those who fought, suffered, and were imprisoned and died for human freedom against political oppression and economic slavery. And I think that's true in the long run. But in the short run, quite often, economic slavery can be dressed up to seem perfectly respectable. So I want to go back to the New England mills of the early 1800s. In Lowell, Massachusetts, the first industrial revolution in the United States is what drew women into the factory first. And this trend played very well into the Yankee virtues of diligence and hard work. But the Puritan attitudes about women resisted employment of the fairer sex. So the tedious and grueling mill life had to be given a veneer of respectability. And the mill owners did that. They said, not only will these girls send home money, but also we'll give them moral training and religious instruction, and we'll watch over them with a paternalistic eye. For many young women, what began as an exciting way to escape from their parents and the farm really turned into a debtor's prison without escape. The Civil War, with its labor shortage, drew in more women, a lot of them war widows. So when women are needed, they're brought into the workforce, that's for sure. It was called a cheap female labor market. At one point, of the 22,000 women and girls who were employed at the Lowell, Massachusetts and the Paterson, New Jersey site, half of them were between the ages of 14 and 18. 11,000 girls. 36% of those women did not reach the age of 25. 36% died before their 25th birthday. That's how brutal life was. Now, women led many protests during the early 1800s, but it took a lot of time for women to be accepted into traditional unions. The explicitly female working women's union formed in 1863 by New York sewers. The first national union to take a stand for women was the National Labor Union, formed in 1866. And the most powerful union of the 1800s, the Knights of Labor, did not let women in until 12 years after it was founded, and that was 1881. Susan B. Anthony's newspaper, The Revolution, agitated for women's rights and organizing women workers. In 1868, the Working Women's Association was founded, and in 1869, the first National Union of Women was created by shoe stitchers in Lynn, Massachusetts. And they advocated for the radical idea of equal pay for equal work. 1869. Their strike got the ear of a Baltimore manufacturer who actually did offer them higher wages and rehired them after the strike. In many instances, in fact, female workers earned greater concessions than their male counterparts in the 1800s. They were so effective for an 1884's textile strike that the leader of the Knights of Labor called them, without irony, the best men in the order. So while walking the walk and battling paternalistic stereotypes, women also had to negotiate class antagonisms. When privileged women like Jane Addams or Lillian Wald got involved in labor issues through their settlement houses, men began to take the plight of women more seriously. Samuel Gompers, head of the AFL-CIO, who was a friend of Felix Adler and a regular attender of ethical culture meetings in New York, helped forge an alliance that really became the backbone of the women's organizing trade union movement in the early 1900s. And that alliance was sometimes supported, but it was also sometimes undermined by those who were more comfortable, the influential middle and upper class reformers of the organization called the Women Trade Union League. It thrived off of the energy of two very different groups. The more educated Protestant New England reformers and the young working class women usually from new immigrant groups like the Irish or the Italian and Jewish groups as well. But the privileged women did walk with the strikers and protected them from abuse by police and advocated for their cause, even though they were nicknamed the Mink Brigade by the press.
What?
The Mink Brigade. Now, at times, the wealthier women did marginalize the radical groups because they preferred more paternalistic and slower reform. The WTUL, for example, did not approve of the strategies or unladylike behavior of people like Mother Jones or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Those elite reformers were less comfortable with growing numbers of Jews from Eastern Europe who tended to lean towards radical socialist solutions to wage slavery. Many Jewish women came from cultures that embraced social unionism and broader change. This was clear when a lot of the garment workers took to the streets in Philadelphia and in New York. Women in the needle trades were some of the most radical, and in one song in Working Women's Music, the lyrics read, "In the black winter of 1909, we froze and bled on the picket line. We showed the world that women could fight, and we rose and won with a woman's might." And they did win quite a bit. They fought in 1909, a strike that was known as the Uprising of 20,000, was led by the International Ladies Garment Union. And after violent thugs attacked this primarily female workforce, one of the manufacturers, the Rosenbrush brothers, rushed to try to settle and gave them higher wages and better hours because they were worried about bad publicity. But that was one of the first significant labor victories in the garment trade in New York. Now, ironically, one of the companies that did not settle in this strike was the Triangle Waist Shirtwaist Company. Many of you know that a couple of years after that strike in 1912, a fire in their New York factory killed 146, primarily women and children, who either burned to death, suffocated, or leapt from the 10-story high building windows in front of a noontime New York crowd that became shocked and outraged. And it took that for the government to start to act. There was a new ally in the labor movement. After the 1912 fire, Rose Scheidemann, who served on investigative committees and testified before the New York legislature, was president of the New York Women's Trade Unions League. And she was one of a number of women who, in the mold of Jane Addams, quote, opened the eyes of male unionists to the positive aspects of government regulation. So government was suddenly brought into the labor movement in a stronger way around 1910s. Fast forward 20 more years, and you'll see a woman who was bolstered by her husband's pro-union policy, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was described in one book called She Was One of Us, Eleanor Roosevelt and the American Worker, as follows. Mrs. Roosevelt believed that everyone deserved a right to a decent job, a living wage, safe working conditions, and a voice at work. Her compelling vision of labor rights as human rights, notice the broadening of the perspective, was widely known during her lifetime but has been marginalized and forgotten since her death. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady to be a union member. She was part of the Newspapers Guild. And when she died, a union card was found in her wallet. Mrs. Roosevelt spoke out in support of government regulations like the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, guaranteeing the right to join unions and collective bargaining. And she defended the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act that established minimum wage, overtime pay, and the 40-hour work week. Jump 20 years more, government continues to support women's rights in the Civil Rights Act. Now, some people might not know this. I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, but this was an incident in where, when it was being drafted, a Virginia senator named Howard Smith put the word sex into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act as a way to try to make people think how absurd it was that we were going to ask employers to take into account the sex of women. It was trying to derail the rest of the bill. When the act was about to pass, a committee tried to take the word sex out, and Senator Margaret Chase Smith and Representative Arthur Griffiths threatened to derail the bill, so it stayed in. So because of a bigoted joke, after that act passed, employers were not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. Soon after that, you begin to see the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission that was flooded with complaints about sexual harassment. Industrial giants like AT&T and General Motors were fined and forced to change their policies. Oddly, though, within the union movement, women were still marginalized. This was a challenge that Karen Nussbaum confronted all of her career. She recalled back in the 1950s when National Secretaries Day began. You know what bosses, what the big part of that was? Anybody know? Bosses bought their secretary roses. They bought them roses. And so Martha Nussbaum in 1973 started a movement called Raises, Not Roses. You can't buy us off anymore, is what she was saying. Well, she started an organization called 925, for the hours, that eventually got accepted by the Service Employees Union, and local 925 became a union, and Martha was the head of it. Well, in 1974, PBS did a documentary on that, about the rising feminist consciousness in the labor movement and in the workforce. And that caught the eye of Jane Fonda, who produced the film 9 to 5. How many have seen that? Very, very, very dated, but powerful film, because people saw it. And no longer was the conversation about whether or not there was sexual harassment in the workplace. It was, what are we going to do about it? And that changed the national dialogue. 20 years later, 1993, President Clinton appointed Martha Nussbaum as director of the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor. And 3 years later, she headed up the AFL-CIO's new Working Women's Department. And she's currently the director of a group called Working America, which is the community affiliate of the AFL-CIO. Now, in her work, she understood that in organizing working women, different sorts of tactics may have to come about. For example, she offered organizing meetings at lunchtime, not after work, because it was women that were still burdened with more family duties after work. So she also made daycare available at union meetings. Now, she had lots of success, but she also talks quite a bit about how the potential of working women has not been realized. And when asked, she gives a number of reasons why. And I find these very interesting. First, she says, certain safety valves had been let off. Like, some women had access to higher level paying jobs due to the feminist movement of the 60s. There was still a huge pay gap, but enough women got in positions of power that the public pressure for gender equality began to ease, unfortunately. Second, she said that more working women felt alienated and less likely to work in groups. And maybe this is part of what Robert Putnam wrote in his book Bowling Alone, about how Americans were becoming more and more isolated from each other. But Nussbaum talks about it when she says, well, look at Hollywood, look at two heroes. And she just says this is symbolic. In 1979, Norma Ray, played by Sally Fields, was the feminist icon hero. She got people together, got women organized. By working together, she gained success. In the year 2000, one of the icons of a strong female was Erin Brockovich. But she succeeded by working alone. So she saw a shift in the way people were approaching it. Third, Nussbaum said there were factors like globalization, farmization, contract labor that just weakened labors overall, and you add to that the anti-labor policies of Bush and Reagan administrations, and it's no wonder that working women have it harder. And finally, Nussbaum also said that the feminism of the 60s and 70s didn't sufficiently unify women. She said this, and this is interesting. The middle-class housewife felt threatened by attacks on the traditional role of women in the family, in the home. That is where they felt their power, in the home. It shouldn't have been about threatening homemakers. The women's movement failed to deliver on the economic and community side of the agenda. If all women had come together to demand things like daycare opportunities for their children and other welfare issues like flexible hours, then the socioeconomic classes of women, all classes, might have come together and pushed for real change. End quote. That last insight, I think, is part of the reason why I still think there's an untapped potential of working women in the labor movement. In one interview, Nussbaum said that she was not interested in just furthering women's rights. She wanted to bring women's wisdom into play in a whole host of social justice issues, because they all interacted. And I think you see that through history. Jane Addams understood that, because when she started her settlement house, she understood how social problems were all interconnected. You couldn't just push one agenda. You couldn't end poverty if you didn't support women's reproductive health. You couldn't stop disease if you didn't deal with the issue of improving working conditions and sanitation. And you weren't going to stop war unless you get people to count more of the profits. All of these issues interacted, and she understood that. In addition, Jane Addams knew that there was a stereotype of women, and she used that stereotype to her advantage. As a woman, she was able to have more effect in politics because she expanded the idea of a woman's sphere. If women were supposed to take care of the family and the home, Jane Addams educated society to say, in the modern city life, our home includes the streets, because our children are playing in the dumps. So we need good garbage sanitation services. Because the meat packers were poisoning their product, we need government regulation to defend the dinner table. Historian Kessler Harris observed similarly that unionized women are most successful when promoting, quote, women's particular needs and special attention to sanitation and cleanliness. So it's this odd combination of a stereotype impressed and having to turn it around and use it as a tool, and then get rid of it. But the same goes for child rearing. In the 1850s, America was predominantly agricultural. Children and women were side by side during the workday. But today, 70% of adults who work outside the home have children. And so they need reliable, affordable daycare. And unions should demand family-friendly policies and healthier work-family balance. Early female unions like the Women's Trade Union League did sponsor gym classes, drama clubs, choral groups, orchestras, educational opportunities. But even more important, for the success of labor, the web of relationships and understanding and trust necessary to strengthen the social fabric is something that was a part of the strategy. Nussbaum noted when she was organizing women how much conversation and connection meant. She said, quote, the way we talk to people, the emphasis on repeated discussions with people. We didn't expect that you'd lay down a membership card and get somebody to sign up. We knew it took 5 conversations with every person that we were talking to before they would warm up to the idea of doing this scary thing of joining a union, end quote. So this sort of groundwork, this conversation about shared experiences and common problems, helped create powerful alliances in the early labor movement and can work today. One historian said that most women are, quote, better socialized for union work because contrary to the American ethic, women overwhelmingly believe it is more effective to join together to solve problems. Well, maybe, but I certainly believe that today's challenges need more idealism and more radicalism, which is really the heart of my talk. And I see that in the heritage of organizing women. I see that idealism and radicalism. I'm going to turn to first the woman who is vilified as the most dangerous woman in America, Mother Jones. Her name was Mary Harris Jones, and for 60 years, this self-described hellraiser talked about the rights of the most marginalized workers. She spoke at union halls, crumbling tenement houses, company towns. And she was a member of nearly every radical organization of her time. She was a member of the International Workers of the World, otherwise known as the Wobblies. She was in the Knights of Labor. She was part of the United Mine Workers. She was in the Socialist Party. Muckraking author Upton Sinclair said, she had force, she had wit, above all, she had the fire of indignation. All over the country she roamed. Wherever she went, the flame of protest rose up. Her story was a veritable odyssey of revolt. One historian said, in the miners' cause, she waded creeks, faced machine guns, and taunted many a mine guard to shoot an old woman if they dared. Her nickname came from her feisty defense of the powerless, like a mother bear defending her cubs. In 1903, she marched with hundreds of children, many of them maimed from industrial work, from Philadelphia to Teddy Roosevelt's Long Island summer home. Their banners had scrawled demands, including, prosperity is here, where is ours? But they also demanded things like, we want more schools and less hospitals. In other words, we want to be in more schools and not in hospitals. And also, we want time to play. These were bold, thoughtful, creative, and radical slogans. And and I think we need more Mother Jones today. Maybe we need more Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who I mentioned earlier. She lived from 1890 to 1960, and when she was at 16, she gave her first public talk. It was called What Socialism Will Do for Women. She organized garment workers here in Pennsylvania, and she soon ended up in New York, where Theodore Dreiser said she was an East Side Joan of Arc. She was lauded in a popular song called The Rebel Girl that was written by labor activist Joe Hill. I'm going to sing that for you later today. And she worked to reform the union movement. She criticized it for being male-dominated and not addressing women's needs. She became a leader in the industrial workers of the world, and she was a founding member of the ACLU, partially because during World War I she spoke up so much she got arrested 10 times. Never got convicted, but did get arrested 10 times, and began to see that free speech might be something that needs to be protected. It wasn't protected well in the 1950s, when she was still going at it, and she was arrested for violating the Smith Act, which made advocacy of radical ideas a crime. Mind control. After becoming national chairwoman of the Communist Party of the United States in 1961, she visited the USSR many times, and she died there at 74 years old, and they gave her a state funeral in Red Square with 25,000 people attending. Now, I know that a funeral in Red Square with 25,000 people attending might be a red letter for some of you. I, however, think we might need a little bit more of that these days. That's my personal conviction. I think we need the socialist idealism of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, or perhaps the radical trade unionism of a Mother Jones, or maybe we need the consistent activism of people like Ms. Evelyn Alloy. I want to call you up here, Evelyn, and ask you to say a few things, and she might, if we can get her to sing a song that she wrote. Would you come up? Wherever you'd like.
That was an extremely penetrating, all-encompassing speech that we heard from Hugh, and I don't presume to add to it.